How should we categorize the mind? Is there something like a tennis forehand area in the brain? Or should we rather think in very general terms like sensory motor integration? In other words, what would be a good cognitive ontology? So at some stage, philosophers and neuroscientists hope to just find this cognitive ontology in the brain. They hope to find one-to-one mappings between neural structure and cognitive functions. So for example, they would say memory can be mapped to the hippocampus, Broca's area does speech production, and Wernicke's area is for speech comprehension. But at the current stage of neuroimaging research, as many of my colleagues have already pointed out, there appears to be this many-to-many mapping of neural structures to cognitive function. This means that there is both pluripotency and degeneracy in the brain. Yeah, it's okay. I can hover around. So at least some brain areas support multiple mental functions, and at least some mental functions can be performed by multiple brain structures. And this is then called the many-to-many problem. If the same cognitive function can be performed by many brain structures, and if brain structures can support many cognitive functions, then how are we to interpret brain data? So now when we see something light up in the hippocampus, there could be many things that the person is performing. So there's a few responses available to this many-to-many problem. We could accept, like, this is just how it is, this is what the brain is, this is what psychology is, or perhaps we're using the wrong cognitive ontology. Perhaps we should just adjust neural categories and or cognitive categories to make them neatly fit together. And this is, this debate is now an emerging debate on cognitive ontology, and I'll first talk about a few positions in that debate. Then I'll argue that they're all based on what I call the mapping norm. And I propose a different norm. I say that the mapping norm is problematic and that rather we should use the causal norm. We should look at whether variables or categories are causally efficacious rather than worry about whether they map onto something. In the fifth part, I'll talk about some advantages of the causal norm. And then last, I'll talk about a possible problem of my view, which is the explosion problem, but then I'll argue it's not a real problem. I'll explain a few positions in the debate. So we could say that a many-to-many mapping is the current state, and then there are people that revise neural or cognitive categories to end up with all these different mappings, like you see here in the picture. So I'll first talk about the many-to-one group, and Price and Friston are a good example of this, I think. They try and revise cognitive ontology by looking at the different functions that a brain area performs. So they take the posterior lateral fusiform area as an example. They say on one level of description, you could say that it does many different things like visual word form identification or naming color patches. But on another level of description, you could just say what it does is sensory motor integration, just like Joe already mentioned. And this is what they do for a lot of areas of the brain. And then they hope to find many-to-one structure-function mappings. Because sensory motor integration will then be the only function of the posterior lateral fusiform area. But on the other hand, sensory motor integration is what a lot of other areas in the brain do as well. So hence the many-to-one mapping. Then there's the one-to-many group. What they do is they try to broaden the grain of neural categories to, for example, networks, and or they narrow the grain of cognitive categories to very context-specific functions. So an example in neuroscience is to link the dorsal stream to the where of sensory processing. So the neural category dorsal stream is a pretty wide category. It's quite a big part of the brain, while the where of sensory processing is very specific. And this makes sure then that every time someone is processing the where of sensory processing, the where of sensory information, it will be in the dorsal stream. However, it could be that the dorsal stream also does other things in other contexts. So hence, you end up with the one-to-many structure-function mapping. Then there's, let's say, a more radical proposal, the one-to-one mapping group. This is, these people try to really revise the ontology quite extensively. I guess this would be especially the group that Joe talked about, where folk ontology doesn't really have a role to play anymore. Poldrack et al., for example, they start with trying to differentiate between the neural activation connected to 8 different cognitive tasks, and you'll see those on the right. And they found out that, very broadly, that a 6-dimensional model can successfully distinguish between them. Then they made a unique fingerprint, so to say, of the loadings of each of these dimensions on the cognitive task. And this makes it possible to connect them in this one-to-one fashion. So every cognitive task only has one fingerprint, and vice versa, every fingerprint has only one of these cognitive tasks attached to it. This was a bit quick, but I have a feeling that Mike Anderson will talk about this as well, so let's hope he does. So I want to argue that all these groups try to revise the cognitive ontology based on what I call the mapping norm. Employing the mapping norm means to strive for a certain structure-function mapping relation between cognitive and neural concepts when building a cognitive ontology. However, the mapping norm comes with quite substantial metaphysical assumptions. It's not neutral about the relation between mind and brain. Instead, I think it's actually an a priori stance on the relation between neural and cognitive categories. But then how would we know these mapping relations before actually doing experiments? So that's why I'm saying we should use the causal norm instead. We should worry about which categories are causally relevant and make that the criterion for membership of the ontology. So what does causally relevant mean? And how do we test which entities then should be in our cognitive ontology? Yes. The theory of difference making, for example, as developed by Woodward, provides a good way to do this, I think. A central notion in the difference making account is that causal relations can be discovered by manipulation. C causes E if, through the right manipulation or intervention on C, E changes as a result of it. So, for example, the atmospheric pressure is a cause of storms. If, by changing the atmospheric pressure, the incidence of storms changes, then you can say, yes, A has a causal influence on S, storms. And that's a good way to sort out causes from correlations, like, for example, the barometer reading. If you change the barometer reading, if you manipulate it, then the incidence of storms will not change. So then you know it's a correlation. Or to give a more neuroscience example, neuroscientific example, if you manipulate the hippocampus of someone, you would probably see that there is some change in their performance of memory functions. There are a lot of conditions for establishing interventionist relations, like how to characterize the variables and how to go about it. But these are quite technical, so I'm just going to skip them and go right to the advantages. Okay, so say we do find one-to-one mappings. What would successful explanations look like? We could look at a scanner, see that the hippocampus is active, and know that someone is memorizing something. And vice versa, we would know every time someone is memorizing something, their hippocampus would be active. But a mapping relation is not very specific, so to say. It can refer to mere correlations, temporal sequences, effect-to-cause generalizations, and incomplete explanations, as Craver said. And that's going to be my main argument here, that the mapping norm gives us very limited explanations, and that good explanations should be able to tell us about a lot more than just mapping relations. So the causal norm, on the other hand, allows for more specific questions about the causal relation. So as Woodward says, we can spell out the content of a causal claim more precisely by describing the range or domain of interventions and background circumstances over which it is invariant. So rather than just saying memory maps to the hippocampus, we can say other stuff like doing TMS over the hippocampus for this duration causes memory disturbances, or people who practice memory tasks ostensibly have a bigger hippocampus, as apparently London taxi drivers do, or changing the intensity of a memory task causes more extensive neural activation of the hippocampus. And you'll actually see here that maybe perhaps my view is actually compatible with Fausto's view in the sense that he also wants to do interventions, I guess, rather than correlational studies. Okay, so with the causal norm, we can be much more specific about the relation between cognitive and neural variables. But we can also distinguish between deterministic relations and probabilistic relations. And this is very useful for cognitive neuroscience because, first of all, no two brains are exactly the same. And second, the same cognitive task will not cause exactly the same neural response every time it's performed, even within the same person. So in neuroscience, what people do is actually often already establish these more probabilistic relations rather than deterministic relations. And that's a good fit, I think, with the causal norm. Third, the causal norm allows for investigation of dependency relations between multiple entities. With the causal norm, we don't just map the hippocampus to memory. We can actually investigate much more, like how the hippocampus interacts with other parts of the brain, stressful environments, hormone level, and sleep deprivation. So this is the third advantage and the last for now. Okay, but the reader might be, or not the reader, the listener, might be left with a pressing problem. If causal relevance is the only constraint, and seeing that virtually anything is in some way causally relevant to something, then what does a causal norm really do? Brains are a causally dense system, and in such systems it's very likely that two variables are related causally in some way. And the same goes for psychological systems. So in psychology, everything is likely to be related at least a little bit to everything else for complex and uninteresting reasons. So if the criteria for including a category in a cognitive ontology are too wide, they will just allow too many concepts to be included, and there will be no standardization, but only multiplication. So in order to prevent this from happening, I introduced the notion of graded causal relevance. So while many variables have some causal influence over the effect, there's only a few that have the specific shape and strength that we're looking for. And there's a few guidelines which can help us do this. Specificity, proportionality, determinacy, systematicity, stability, and proliferation. I won't have time to go into all of them, but I'll discuss two of them. Yes. So first, specificity. A cause is more specific than another when it has more fine-grained influence over the effect. In general, a specific relationship between C and E is where, by manipulating C into many different states, we can reliably manipulate E into many different states. In other words, a variable has a good causal relevance when it has a range of values that reliably correspond to a range of values of the effect. So take, for example, the volume of a phone when I'm playing music on it, which is adapted from boring and old radio example. So both the on-off button and the volume buttons will have a causal effect on the volume that my phone produces. You can click the volume buttons and it will go up and down, or you can turn the phone off or on, and then the sound will go off and on as well. But for the buttons, there's a range of values that these buttons can take, which correspond neatly to the volume produced. And manipulating the on-off button can only do two things. I mean, there's either sound or no sound. So in this sense, the volume buttons are just a better cause because they are more specific. And there's proliferation. So I think when we're dealing with causation in the cognitive neuroscientific realm, it's a good thing if a cause is a cause of many different things. Working memory is a good variable because manipulating it will have an effect on many different things. Similarly, a certain neural region can be demarcated as such because manipulating it will have an effect on many cognitive or even neural variables. And this is called proliferation, or sometimes also robustness. There is an important precondition, however, for this guideline, is that these causal relations are still very specific and stable. Sometimes, when a variable has an effect on many different things, it means that it will not be able to fine-tune the effects on these things very well. So take, for example, a martin in a car. I don't know if you have them in Italy, but in the Netherlands we do. They're these little rodents, and they're apparently attracted to the smell of a car engine, which means that they crawl into the car engine and start biting things. So suppose a martin crawls into your car and starts biting various bits. It'll have an effect on many functions of your car. The biting martin is very prolific as a cause. But those causal relations aren't specific or stable at all. The martin isn't able to fine-tune performance of your car by biting things, so it's not specific. It's also not stable because one time your brakes will stop working and the other time some other part of the engine will stop. Don't know much about cars, but anyway. Specificity and proliferation are guidelines which help us to establish which variables are more causally relevant than others. And this then will help solve this explosion problem. The number of categories in our cognitive ontology will not explode because the guidelines will be able to select variables that can go into the cognitive ontology based on their causal relevance. So in conclusion, what I've done in this presentation is to give a brief glimpse of the cognitive ontology debate, which I argue is mostly based on the mapping norm. And I've argued that we should rather use the causal norm because in the end it will give us better explanations. Thanks for your attention.